The morning my sister handed me a coffee and told me she loved me, I had no idea it would be the last honest thing she ever said to me. I remember standing in my mother's kitchen in Oakville, still wearing the black dress from the funeral, watching Claire wrap her hands around her own mug like she owned the place. 3 days after we buried our mother, and she already had that look, the one I'd spent 38 years learning to read and choosing to ignore. Soft eyes. Careful smile. The look she wore whenever she wanted something. Our mother had died on a Tuesday in November, quietly, the way she'd lived without asking anyone for anything. Breast cancer, 18 months, and she'd spent most of that time worrying about Claire and me more than herself. She kept saying, "You two are all each other has now." She made me promise, twice, that I'd look after my sister. I promised. I meant it. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that my sister had spent the last 4 months of our mother's life sitting with the estate lawyer alone, rewriting a future that was supposed to belong to both of us. My name is Rachel Morrow. I was an elementary school teacher in Hamilton for 11 years. I drove a 2019 Honda Civic, I paid my taxes on time, I called my mother every Sunday, and I genuinely believed that the people who loved you didn't lie to your face while their hands were still warm from your coffee. I was wrong about that. The will reading was a week after the funeral. I drove to the lawyer's office on a gray Thursday morning, expecting to spend an hour sorting through logistics, the house in Oakville, my mother's RRSP, the small investment account she'd built over 30 years of substitute teaching and careful living. Claire and I had talked about it vaguely, the way you talk about things you don't want to make real. We'd split everything, obviously. That was always the understanding. I sat down across from the lawyer, a quiet man named Gerald Ashworth, and I watched his face as he opened the folder, and I felt the first crack before he said a single word. The house went to Claire. The investment account, just under $340,000, went to Claire. The RRSP, with Claire already named as sole beneficiary, went to Claire. There was a $12,000 amount set aside for me, described in the document as for Rachel, with love, for her future. $12,000. I sat very still. Gerald Ashworth was looking at somewhere slightly left of my face. Claire was looking at her hands. "When was this version signed?" I asked. My voice came out steadier than I felt. 8 weeks before your mother passed, he said. 8 weeks. When our mother was on her 3rd round of medications, when she was sleeping 14 hours a day, when I was driving up from Hamilton every other weekend to cook and clean and sit beside her bed reading aloud from the novels she loved. 8 weeks before she died, when Claire had apparently found time to sit with a lawyer and restructure everything. I looked at my sister. She finally looked back at me. "Mom wanted this," she said. "She told me you were more independent. She said you'd be fine." I picked up my bag. I thanked Gerald Ashworth. I walked out to my car in the parking lot, sat in the driver's seat for a long time, and then I called my school and told them I needed the rest of the week. I drove back to my apartment in Hamilton, and I stood in my kitchen and I thought about the jade bracelet. My mother had a jade bracelet, pale green, simple, carved with a small floral pattern. It had belonged to her mother, who had brought it from Hong Kong when she immigrated in 1971. My grandmother had pressed it into my mother's hands before she died, and my mother had worn it almost every day for 20 years. When she got too sick to leave the house, she'd taken it off and kept it on her nightstand. She'd told me not once, not twice, but 3 times across those 18 months that the bracelet was for me. "You're the one who has her hands," she used to say. My grandmother and I had the same slim wrists, the same way of gesturing when we talked. The bracelet was not mentioned in the will. When I went back to the Oakville house the following weekend to collect some of my mother's personal items, things I'd brought her during her illness, my own books, a quilt I'd made, I noticed the bracelet was not on the nightstand. I noticed Claire was wearing it. I stood in the doorway of my mother's bedroom and I looked at my sister's wrist and I felt something go very quiet inside me. The kind of quiet that isn't peace. "That's Mom's bracelet," I said. "I know," Claire said. "She gave it to me." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I said okay, and I went back downstairs and I loaded my things into the car. And on the drive back to Hamilton, I made a decision. I would not fall apart. I would not beg. I would figure out what had actually happened, and I would handle it properly. The problem was that handling it properly required money I didn't have. Contesting a will in Ontario is not a simple process. I made calls that week. The retainer alone for an estate litigation lawyer was between $5,000 and $10,000, and the process could take a year or longer. My savings, modest on a teacher's salary, were not built for a legal fight. And I still had rent, a car payment, and the particular exhaustion of grief that makes everything feel like wading through cold water. I took a leave of absence from teaching. I needed to think. I needed distance from the classroom where I had to be cheerful and patient every day when I felt neither. It was my colleague Janet who mentioned the job. She'd seen it posted in a Facebook group, a private household in the Muskoka region looking for a live-in personal assistant/household manager. The employer was listed only as a private individual. The pay was $4,200 a month, accommodation included, meals included. The posting said long-term commitment preferred and discretion essential. It's probably some retired executive who needs someone to manage their calendar, Janet said. You're organized, you're calm, you're good with difficult people. You spent a decade managing 28 8-year-olds at once. How hard can one rich person be? I applied. I received a response within 48 hours. A phone interview with a woman named Patricia, who described herself as the household manager, asked me careful, precise questions for 45 minutes. She wanted to know how I handled conflict, how I managed my own stress, whether I was comfortable with a non-traditional working environment. I said I was comfortable with most things at the moment. A week later, I drove north on Highway 11 with my car packed with 2 suitcases, a box of books, and the specific hollowness of a person who has lost their mother, their inheritance, and their sense of what family means, all within 30 days. The property was on a lake outside of Huntsville. The driveway was long and gravel, lined with birch trees. The main house was large but not ostentatious, dark cedar siding, a wide porch, the kind of house that says old money without saying anything loudly. Patricia met me at the door. She was a small, efficient woman in her 60s who showed me my rooms, a private suite above the garage, separate entrance, well furnished, clean, and then handed me a schedule and an employment contract. She explained the position. I would manage the household, scheduling, correspondence, coordinating with contractors and vendors, managing groceries and household supplies, organizing the main house for the occasional visits from staff. There was one additional element to the role. The owner of the property, a man named Thomas Whitfield, had recently had a serious accident. He was recovering. He required a structured, calm environment. He did not like visitors. He was, Patricia said carefully, a private person going through a difficult time. What kind of accident? I asked. A fall, she said. He's dealing with some mobility issues. You won't be his caregiver, we have medical support for that, but you'll be in the house. He may ask for things occasionally. The main thing is that you keep the household running and don't treat him like a patient. I said I understood. I met Thomas Whitfield that evening. He was in the main sitting room, in a wheelchair, looking out at the lake through the large windows. He was younger than I'd expected, mid-40s, maybe, with dark hair going gray at the sides and an expression that had clearly decided, at some point, to stop performing pleasantness for people. He looked at me, the way you look at something you're not sure is going to work out. Patricia says you're a teacher, he said. Was, I said. On leave. Why? Family situation. He looked at me for a moment. Patricia also says you're discreet. I'm not particularly interested in other people's business, I said, which was mostly true. I'm interested in doing a job well and having a quiet place to think. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not warmth, exactly. More like recognition. That's all I want too, he said. I won't pretend the first weeks were easy. Thomas was not warm. He was demanding, in a precise, impersonal way, specific about temperature, about noise, about the way the house was organized. He had opinions about how correspondence should be handled and wasn't shy about expressing them. But he wasn't cruel, and he wasn't irrational. He was a man in pain who'd built a wall around it and called the wall standards. I understood that, actually. I understood it quite well. I also noticed things. The way he would be at his desk until late at night, working. The slight way he'd angle his chair when he was tired, favoring his left side. The occasional phone calls I wasn't supposed to hear where his voice dropped and the careful composure disappeared for a moment. He was managing something large, something that had nothing to do with mobility. It was the third week when I found the files by accident. I was organizing the study. Thomas had asked me to sort through a backlog of correspondence, and I came across a folder that had slipped behind one of the desk drawers. I opened it, thinking it was household files. It was legal correspondence. His name. And the name of a company, Whitfield Timber, a forestry operation with holdings across northern Ontario, and a series of letters from lawyers suggesting that during the period of Thomas's recovery, certain decisions had been made by his brother, Derek, that Thomas had not authorized. Contracts signed. Assets moved. A refinancing arrangement on the Muskoka property itself that Thomas appeared to have no knowledge of. I closed the folder. I put it on the desk. And then I sat very still for a moment, because I recognized, in a visceral way that had nothing to do with the specifics, exactly what it felt like to read those papers. I didn't say anything. It wasn't my place. I went back to sorting correspondence. But a few days later, Thomas asked me, out of nowhere, whether I'd found anything unusual in the study. There was a folder that had slipped behind the drawer, I said. Legal correspondence. I put it on the desk. He looked at me steadily. Did you read it? Enough to know what it was. A long pause. And it's not my business, I said. Unless you'd like it to be. He didn't answer that day. But 2 days later he came to find me in the kitchen in the morning and sat down across the table and said, my brother has been managing the company while I've been recovering. He was supposed to be holding things in trust. I see, I said. He's been telling the board that I'm not capable of resuming leadership. That the accident left me cognitively impaired. He said it flatly, like he'd practiced saying it, without emotion. He's had 18 months. I poured him coffee. Is there documentation? Of what he's authorized in your name? He looked at me differently then. Not surprised, but recalibrating. Yes. And a lawyer you trust? My previous lawyer retired. Derek recommended the current firm. He paused. I've been trying to determine whether that firm is conflicted. That seems like something to determine quickly, I said. It was not a dramatic conversation. There was no moment where we looked meaningfully at each other or made declarations. But something shifted that morning. A door opened, professionally and honestly, and I stepped through it because I recognized the geography on the other side. I helped Thomas organize his documentation over the following weeks. It was, genuinely, within my skill set. I was meticulous, patient, comfortable with complex paper trails. I cross-referenced correspondence dates with financial records. I helped him draft a careful letter requesting documentation from the current legal firm. I researched independent estate and corporate lawyers in Toronto who specialized in family business disputes. During this time, I also told him about my mother, and the will, and Claire. Not all at once. In pieces, the way you tell things when you're not sure you're ready but you're more tired of carrying them than you are of being seen. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When I mentioned the bracelet, his jaw tightened. She's wearing it, he said. It wasn't a question. At the Christmas function, her workplace posted on social media, I said. I recognized it immediately. You should document that, he said. I know, I said. I'm waiting until I have a lawyer I can afford. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I'd like to help with that. I'm not asking. I know you're not, he said. That's why I'm offering. His name was Martin Osei, and he was a wills and estates lawyer in Toronto who Thomas had used on an unrelated matter years earlier and trusted absolutely. I spoke with Martin in January, in a video call from the study while Thomas was at a physio appointment. Martin was careful and clear. The will could be challenged on the basis of undue influence, given the timing, our mother's health, and Claire's documented sole access to the lawyer. It would take time. It would require evidence. But there was a case. He also told me something else. The jade bracelet, if I could prove it had been promised to me and was taken after death, could constitute misappropriation of estate property. I started keeping notes. I found a card my mother had written me the previous Easter where she'd mentioned, in her careful handwriting, the bracelet that will be yours one day. I found a text message from 2 years earlier where she'd referenced it directly. I contacted 2 of her friends, women, she'd known for 30 years who were willing to make statements about what our mother had told them. In the meantime, Thomas's situation was moving forward in a separate but parallel arc. He had retained new legal counsel. The documentation I'd helped him organize had uncovered a series of transactions Derek had processed using a power of attorney that Thomas had granted in the immediate aftermath of his accident, a document that had been drafted by Derek's own contact, signed when Thomas was on significant pain medication, and used far beyond its intended scope. Thomas was not cognitively impaired. He was also not as physically limited as Derek had led the board to believe. He had been working with a physiotherapist privately and had been making steady progress. He had not shared this with Derek, or with the board. He'd been waiting. I found out the extent of Thomas's recovery on a February evening when I came down to the kitchen at midnight for water and found him standing at the counter making tea. Not in the wheelchair. Standing, with a cane, moving slowly but clearly moving. He looked at me. I looked at him. "How long?" I asked. "Limited mobility for about 4 months, he said. "But functional." "Derek doesn't know." "No." I sat down at the kitchen table. "When's the board meeting?" "March 15th. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "You should walk in yourself." Something crossed his face that was, I thought, the closest thing to relief I'd seen from him. "That was the plan," he said. The board meeting was in Toronto, in the offices of Whitfield Timbers Bay Street lawyers. I drove Thomas down myself on a cold March morning. He wore a suit. He had the cane, but used it lightly. He had a binder organized with the documentation we'd compiled over 3 months. Derek was already in the boardroom when we arrived. I watched his face when Thomas walked in. The expression he went through confusion, recalibration, something that might have been fear was, I will be honest, deeply satisfying. I waited in the reception area. Thomas had insisted I come along and equally insisted there was nothing useful I could do inside, which was fair. Patricia brought me tea. We sat in padded chairs and listened to the muffled voices behind the doors and waited. The meeting lasted 3 hours. When Thomas came out, his expression was composed, but there was something underneath it that was different, lighter, or perhaps more settled. He walked to where I was sitting and he said, "Derek has been removed from his role pending a full audit. The board is supporting a transition back to my leadership." "Good," I said. "The property refinancing has been reversed. The legal firm Derek recommended is being reviewed for conflict of interest." "Also good." He sat down beside me, which he almost never did. He preferred to stand or keep moving. "Thank you," he said. "For the files. For the organization. For not treating me like I was broken." "You weren't broken," I said. "You were waiting." He looked at me for a moment. "How's your case?" "Martin filed the undue influence challenge last week," I said. Claire's lawyer responded. "We're in the process." He nodded slowly. "The bracelet?" "Still on her wrist, as far as I know. Let's make sure it doesn't stay there." The estate challenge took 7 more months. It is not a fast process, and I won't pretend it was clean or easy. Claire hired a lawyer who was aggressive and unpleasant. There were letters I didn't enjoy reading. There were weeks where I questioned whether it was worth it financially, emotionally, the toll of being in formal dispute with someone who had once been your family. But the evidence was solid. The timing of the will change. The testimony from our mother's friends. The card at Easter. The text messages. The fact that our mother's longtime doctor was willing to provide a statement that she had expressed, during appointments, her intention to leave her assets equally. The fact that Claire had been at the lawyer's office 3 times in the 2 months before the signing, alone, without telling me. The mediation happened in October. I sat across a table from my sister for the first time in 9 months. She looked tired. I probably looked the same. The settlement gave me an equal share of the estate. Half the proceeds from the Oakville house, which had sold by then. Half the investment account. It wasn't everything. The legal costs ate a portion, and mediation is compromise by definition. But it was fair. It was what our mother had intended. At the end of the session, as the lawyers were gathering their papers, I said to Claire, quietly, "The bracelet." She looked at me. "It's mine," I said. "Mom told me." She told her friends. She told her doctor. I have a card in her handwriting. I kept my voice even. "I'd like it back." A long moment. Her lawyer murmured something. Claire looked at the table. She unclipped it from her wrist and set it on the table between us. I picked it up. The jade was cool and smooth and exactly the same pale green as I remembered, the small carved flowers worn soft with decades of being worn and loved. I put it on my wrist. It fit perfectly. I drove back to Muskoka that evening. The birch trees along the driveway had lost their leaves by then, gray and clean against the November sky. Thomas was in the sitting room when I came in, at his desk, the cane propped against the chair. He looked up. He saw the bracelet. He didn't say anything, but something in his expression was not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. "I'd say we both had a reasonably successful autumn," I said. "Reasonably," he agreed. I made tea. We sat by the window and looked at the lake, which was the color of old pewter in the evening light. We didn't talk much. We had gotten comfortable, over those months, with a particular kind of quiet, the kind that isn't absence but presence, two people who have stopped performing and started simply being. I went back to teaching the following September, in Huntsville, a smaller school than Hamilton but one I came to love in a different way. I drove down to Toronto for Martin's final billing conversation in late spring, and I stopped at my mother's grave in Oakville on the way back, and I sat for a while and I told her what had happened. I told her the house sold well. I told her the investment account would help me buy something of my own. I told her I'd found my way through a year I didn't think I could survive. I told her I was wearing the bracelet. I showed her, in the particular way you show things to the quiet, which is simply by being there. Thomas and I have settled into something that doesn't have a clean name. He's resumed full leadership of the company. He comes to Huntsville occasionally, and I drive up to the Muskoka property on weekends when the lake is worth looking at, which is most of them. He is still demanding and precise and not warm in the way that some people are warm. I am still organized and patient and occasionally too willing to absorb other people's difficulty. We are good for each other, I think, in the way that people are good for each other when they've seen each other at the bottom of something and neither of them flinched. My mother used to say that the people who stay are worth more than the people who sparkle. She said it about my grandmother, who had come to a new country with very little and built a life by being steady and honest and willing to work. She left me the bracelet that came from those hands. And eventually, after everything, I got it back. Some things are worth the long road. Some things are exactly as yours as you always knew they were. You just have to be willing to stand up and say so.